And without further ado, to introduce Paul Golin, I would like to ask a rabbi ordained at the last colloquium in 2009, Rabbi Jody Kornfeld.
I was saying one of the privileges of being ordained at the last colloquium is you get to cross that river and come on up here now, which is really quite exciting for me. This topic, I'm sure you all agree that the colloquium is off to a wonderful start, fascinating, and I have the privilege of introducing Paul Golin to you. And I just want to, excuse me, let you know, apart from what you can read by way of introduction in your program, that I think you're going to sense the passion and the commitment and the deep, the hours and days and months and years of deep thinking about these issues that Paul has put into this. We had the chance not only to meet just before the colloquium, but to meet telephonically. And I was so struck with his commitment to the issues. He gave me sort of the brief outline. I'm not going to preview that for you because he's going to do a masterful job of that. But one of the things that I'm struck with the entire topic that I often say to interfaith couples that I deal with is we come from a tradition that says, honor your mother and your father. And it doesn't have an asterisk that says, unless they're both Jewish. And I think that that's really very informative for how we treat other people, how we embrace other people, and welcome other people. So Paul Golin is the Associate Executive Director, got that straightened out, Director of the Jewish Outreach Institute. He is the co-author of How to Raise Jewish Children, Even When You're Not Jewish Yourself, and a board member of the Jewish Multiracial Network. So without further ado, I present you Paul Golin.
Hello. So I've been speaking to audiences and with individuals inside the Jewish community for a while now on issues of outreach, intermarriage, inclusion. And I like to be a little controversial, and I like to receive a bit of pushback. I like to receive a lot of pushback. This is the first audience where I'm genuinely fearful that we are going to be in total agreement. And I really hope I can find some things that are going to bother you. So my session is called An Optimistic Jewish Future, and anyone who knows me wouldn't really accuse me of being an optimist. They might say I'm a realist if they want to be kind. But the reason why I wanted to talk about optimism is because I've been a Jewish communal professional for 14 years and at the Jewish Outreach Institute for 12. And when I came into it, I bought into the fear-based economy, really, of the Jewish community, which is, as was mentioned earlier, that what if we're the last generation of Jews? Will there be Judaism in the next generation? And my response at that time, because of course the blame was falling on interfaith families, and my response was, no, if we welcome interfaith families, there's potential for growth, it depends on how we welcome them. And at a certain point, I realized that the whole narrative was kind of ridiculous. My mother was born in a displaced persons camp in Berlin a year after World War II. Her parents are survivors of the Holocaust. If in 1941 or 45, or even when my mom was born in 46, the Jews were really asking, are we the last generation? I think that would have been a fair time to ask that question. But when we look around today at what it's like to be Jewish in America, or even Jewish in Israel, which Israel does face real existential threat, but when you visit, when you see the Jewish community, when you recognize the incredible levels of success we have today as Jews, this is the best time to be Jewish in the history of Judaism. There's no better time to be Jewish. And so we really should recognize that the fear actually works against us. Nobody wants to hop on board a sinking ship. I think that pride is something that we all also share, and maybe the fear is what we use to temper that pride so we're not completely out of control. But I think that sometimes the fear really overweighs the Jewish community, especially on its response to intermarriage. And so for many years now, I've really approached it with optimism, and for me personally, realizing that if I was born just 2 generations earlier, how bad my life could have been, and how lucky I am just 2 generations later to be alive and Jewish in America today. And I think if we hold on to that when we speak to people, they'll feel more positive about becoming a part of our community. So I want to share with you my presentation goals, because when I'm listening to somebody, I like to know where they're going. But this is a little deceptive because I'm really going to spend most of my time at number 2. But I want to talk about why this is such a big deal. There are a couple of statistics I want to throw at you that haven't been discussed yet that I think are essential if we're going to have this conversation. I want to talk about what we've actually heard from young adult children of intermarriage, and then I want to kind of get into something a little more out there and abstract, just to see if there's any potential buttons of yours I can push, and then I want to get to the Q&A as soon as I possibly can, because I really enjoy hearing from folks and responding to questions. I have an agenda. I'm an advocate. I like to be upfront. Again, generally, I'm speaking to folks who are a little more suspicious of my message, and I want to just put it out there. I work for an organization that promotes the idea of Big Tent Judaism, that the Jewish community and Judaism is big enough to embrace a wide spectrum of people, and we need to promote the idea that there is a place in the tent for everybody who wants to be a part of our community. So that's my professional agenda, and the arguments that I make for why we should include interfaith family are really threefold: demographic, moral or ethical, and personal. And I'll go into the demographics and the moral ethical piece in more depth, but I want to say a word about the personal, because this has to be a personal conversation. This doesn't exist out in the ether without the Jewish people. This is about people, so everybody comes into it with a personal angle. My personal angle is that I'm intermarried. My wife is from Japan, and I grew up in a conservative, non-egalitarian synagogue in Staten Island, New York. And at age 9, when the rabbi was railing against intermarriage, I said to myself, that's not going to work for me. And what's remarkable is that when you have that feeling at age 9 that something that is so important to a authority figure seems so absurd to you, you start asking a whole bunch of questions about everything else that person is saying, and it made me question every aspect of Judaism. From what I understand, the rabbis in the conservative movement don't rail against intermarriage in the same ways anymore, but I haven't seen it because I don't go to conservative synagogues anymore, shockingly. But my advocacy, I mean, I'm upfront about where I am personally because I'm an advocate and I don't want to be intellectually dishonest about it, but I want to make the point that I'm not advocating for inclusion for my family because I'm saying, hey, I intermarried, and now you should welcome me, and you should bend your morals and ethics to include me because of what I decided. That's not the arguments I'm going to make about why I believe the Jewish community needs to be more open and inclusive. But if I don't put it out there, it's going to come back to me, so that's why I put it out there. And because I think everyone has to acknowledge their own personal interests, and this includes the handful of Jewish demographers that the Jewish community seems to only want to work with. So as far as the advocacy I'm going to talk about on demography and morals, again, even if we agree 100%, perhaps some of what I say will be useful to you as you go back to your communities and hopefully advocate for more inclusion. So why is this a big deal? here are some things that we haven't said yet that I think are essential to say. There are more intermarried households in America today than there are in married households. You don't hear that a lot. What you hear is that half of the Jews intermarry. And what's never explained is the result of that. That is an action that happens, half of the Jews intermarry, but what does that produce? This has been going on for a quarter century now. And this is a little bit of math, so if someone wants to talk to me afterwards to have it explained, don't be embarrassed. But basically, I want to explain how this works. Let's say you've got 4 Jews total in the whole universe, and there's a 50% intermarriage rate. Well, that means that 2 Jews are intermarrying, so they go off and create 2 Jewish households with 2 non-Jews. But the 2 Jews that in-marry are marrying each other, and that only creates 1 Jewish household. So a 50% intermarriage rate, an individual's intermarriage rate, actually means there's double the number of intermarried households created than in-married households. And you never hear that from the Jewish community. But what it means is that today in America, there are more intermarried than in-married households. Now, not all those intermarried households consider themselves Jewish, but many of them do, and many of them incorporate Judaism into their households. And more Americans under the age of 25 have been born to 1 Jewish parent than to 2 Jewish parents. In other words, the heirs of intermarriage are the majority now. And again, not all of them consider themselves Jewish, but many of them do, and many of them who don't are still proud of where they come from, and many of them who don't might actually want to if they were given the opportunity to do so. So I think when we have this conversation, we really have to be aware of the magnitude of this phenomenon in America. You know, for 20 years, we've been saying 50% intermarriage rate as if, you know, it doesn't result in anything. This is the result. And I estimate there's well over 1 million children of intermarriage in America. We saw this in the 2001 National Jewish Population Study. So this survey was done 12 years ago. And they asked people on college campuses age 18 to 27, are you Jewish, in the survey. And of the people who self-identified as Jewish, 48% had 2 Jewish parents, 45% had 1 Jewish parent, and 7% remarkably said neither of their parents were Jewish, but they identify as Jewish. So this is 12 years ago. You had almost as many children of intermarriage in the age range of 18 to 27 who said, I'm Jewish, as you did children of in-marriage. And that was 12 years ago. And that was not including the cohort of behind it, where if you realize my point is that there are many, many more interfaith households. So at this point, I'm very confident in saying if they were to redo this survey again, which they're not because it was expensive and everyone hated the methodology, they would find that now probably these numbers are flipped. So that's the demographic argument. To me, personally, more compelling is the moral argument. If there's something we love about being Jewish, don't we want to share it? You know, the insularity that was both forced on us and in some ways embraced by us worked in some ways, failed horribly for European Jewry in other ways, but ultimately it's of a different age, and we now have to become extroverts, and that's a hard thing, I think, for a lot of the Jewish community. But the thing to keep in mind is that these are our friends and family members. When we talk about welcome the stranger, we're not really talking about stopping random people on the street, although that works for Chabad, but we're talking about our own friends and family members. So to me, I want to talk about the morals and ethics behind everything we do in the Jewish community, and that includes inclusion or exclusion if exclusion is important and relevant to your community. So for example, on the issue of matrilineal and patrilineal descent, which I will define, just in case anybody doesn't know, that for about 2,000 years, Jews have accepted as Jewish anyone born to a Jewish mother. That's matrilineal descent. And within the last 40 years or so, there have been movements in the United States that now accept both matrilineal and patrilineal descent. The better phrase is equilineal descent. But if you're going to argue for or against this, I want to hear the moral or ethical arguments. Now, I've actually heard a pretty good argument for matrilineal only in a roundabout way. Many years ago, I wrote a piece about, I couldn't even find it actually when I was searching for it online. But basically, in the piece, I said, wouldn't it be great if conversion to Judaism today were as simple as it was for the biblical Ruth, who simply made a statement of allegiance, and of course, her allegiance was to the Jewish people first and to the Jewish God second, and then she lived out her life as a Jew and was rewarded by being the great-grandmother of King David. Wouldn't that be great if conversion were that simple? I got a call from an Orthodox rabbi who saw what I wrote, and he explained that I was misreading the text, that just because it wasn't written in the book of Ruth doesn't mean that Ruth didn't have a mikvah, a ritual, and a ritual dip, and didn't have a beit din, a rabbinic court. So I said to him, how did Ruth have a rabbinic court 1,000 years before the first rabbi? And his answer was, either you believe it all or you don't. And I thought that I had no argument. You know, there's no way to argue back against because God said so. You know, and so that, to me, has a beautiful internal logic. Of course, I'm never going to be a part of his community, and 92% of American Jewry won't either, but that has an internal logic to me. Now, when the Reform movement accepted patrilineal descent in 1983, they wrote a responsa, kind of a rabbinic understanding of the halakha, the Jewish law, around this. And obviously, they were pushed to accept patrilineal descent by the demographics around them, and they recognize that. However, if you go read the responsa, and I recommend it if you've never read it because I think it's fairly eloquent, they actually say that we believe in equality between the sexes, and to say, even though this is kind of a reverse equality where the emphasis is on the woman when so often it's just on the man, but in this case, it was the woman only, well, we don't accept that anymore because we now have an understanding of equality between the sexes. And I thought that that makes a good internal argument for the acceptance of patrilineal descent, even though there's also a recognition that this is what the Jews are doing now. The challenge, of course, is in the movement I grew up in, the conservative movement, which has moved on so many other issues of what I believe are ethical issues of inclusion. And most recently, as of yesterday, I don't know if you saw it, that the conservative movement in Israel has decided to ordain gay and lesbian rabbis. A couple of years ago, the movement in the US decided to do it, and the one in Israel said no, and now they've said yes, which is amazing and excellent, and I'm thrilled to hear it. But on every issue of inclusion, women being accepted as part of a minyan, women being ordained as rabbis, driving to synagogue, like on so many issues, and now the inclusion of gay and lesbians, they've followed the ethics and morality of the Jews, which, as we were talking about earlier, really that's who should set the ethics and morals of Judaism. It doesn't exist in the ether. It's about what the Jews are doing. On intermarriage, the conservative movement is holding the line, and I feel that there's just no internal logic to them holding the line. They won't even allow their rabbis to consider officiating at an intermarriage, and technically, you're not even allowed to go to an intermarriage, even if it's your own child, and I know conservative rabbis who have broken that rule because their own children have intermarried. I think it's really unfortunate that they feel that this is the issue, and I ask of them to make the moral or ethical argument, because if they did, and if they said that intermarriage is ethically inferior to in-marriage, if I made a moral digression by marrying the woman that I fell in love with, I'd like to hear that message, and I think it will, at least accelerate the conservative movement in one way or the other. Because if that's really what they're holding to, or if they're holding to this notion that interfaith families can't or don't create Jewish households, well, we've got all this data now, and it's phenomenal. And those of you, I don't know how many here are from Chicago, but Chicago did a demographic study of their Jews very recently and found half of interfaith families are raising their kids exclusively Jewish, and then a whole other percentage after that are raising them Jewish and something else, and only something like 9% are raising them Christian. I mean, we're overwhelmingly winning the appeal on interfaith. It's not a competition, I know, but we're winning on interfaith families in so many communities. And this has now happened in San Francisco, in Boston, in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Baltimore. I mean, if there was another national Jewish population study, I think we would have a very different number on interfaith families raising Jewish children. And this is despite the general, still unwelcome nature of the Jewish community toward interfaith families. So that ethic or moral or logic doesn't hold anymore, and I want them to have that conversation, not because I want to be back in that movement or they should recognize me, but they should recognize that Judaism is only going to speak to people if it is on solid moral and ethical grounds, and I don't think they are on this issue. To me, the big thing is meaning. I made this font really big in case I don't get this point across. I've heard a lot about Jewish education, and it was even mentioned earlier, and I got a Jewish education too, and it was generally miserable, and nobody made the connection to me that this would actually be meaningful to me at some point in my life. So I'd like to shift the conversation from education to meaning, and from everything to meaning, and I really feel that as a community, we're not leading with the meaning of it. And those of us on the inside of the community may know why we're Jewish or how we're Jewish, but we don't spend a whole lot of time articulating that to other people. And if you ask folks, or if you even ask yourself in the mirror, what's so great about being Jewish? Do you have an elevator pitch? Do you have your answer immediately? Can you share that with folks that you meet who are on the margins of Jewish life? I feel like that would be a great practice for folks in the Jewish community to really start talking about the meaning, because I think there is meaning in being Jewish, and I think that is really ultimately what the Jewish community is going to provide for folks, and we would be strengthened by having those conversations. During the panel earlier, Yoni mentioned essentialism, or really what is Judaism, and I think that's the question that we have to get at through conversations about meaning. At the beginning of the 20th century, the organized Jewish community was focused on helping Jews become American, because we were mostly an immigrant population. So the big question was how to be American. We succeeded so well at that we forgot how to be Jewish. So after the 60s, the Jewish community refocused to how to be Jewish. Where we now need to refocus is why be Jewish, and we're not there yet. Our community is still focused on how to, with the assumption that you already know or want to be Jewish. And I think that that's the wrong assumption for us to make. I think if we start answering that question of why be Jewish, it's going to excite people about learning how to do it. But we have to take one step even further back. And that's why I feel optimistic when I talk about the adult children of intermarriage, or the children of intermarriage, because for them and for everybody, we have to answer this question. And the answers that we come up with, I think, are going to create a more interesting Judaism. So at the Jewish Outreach Institute, we talk about barriers to participation in Jewish life. What keeps people from being a part of the Jewish community? Now, I mentioned meaning, and to me, that is the biggest barrier, but that's my bias. There are many, many barriers to participation in Jewish life. For example, I'd mentioned Hebrew before as a potential barrier for somebody who doesn't know Hebrew. But there are barriers of feeling included or feeling excluded or not seeing people that look like you when you walk into a congregation. There are barriers like how far away is the congregation? You know, there are logistical barriers. There are all of these barriers, and what we try to do when we work with the Jewish community is identify what's keeping people from participating and asking, can we lower those barriers without compromising what we feel is our own authenticity? So when we start to think about the children of intermarriage and ask what resonates with them, the Jewish Outreach Institute conducted a couple of studies now of young adult children of intermarriage in their 20s and 30s, which we thought would be interesting to talk to for two reasons. First of all, because they're at a point where they actually still remember how they were raised, and where they are now at a point where they can actually reflect on where they might go. And secondly, because our funders are really interested in this age group. So the two studies we did were a qualitative. We interviewed 90 individuals who identified as having only one Jewish parent, and it's qualitative, but we matched up their answers. We had them do a survey that was similar to the National Jewish Population Survey, which is quantitative, and they matched up on a lot of key indicators, so we feel like we can actually use percentages when we talk about those 90 folks. And then the 2001, which we haven't really published, it was mainly focus groups, and we did an online survey. And here's my caveat: demographics are evil. So, like I said, I'm intermarried. I have been hearing for so many years now about what the intermarried do and don't do. And on every indicator, they're wrong about me. And I know that, so if you want to say 75% of Jews vote liberal, how does that help you when you meet another Jew and he or she might be the 1 out of 4 that's a Republican? You can't just start automatically bashing Mitt Romney and then expect that this person is going to like you. So the numbers don't help you at all when you talk to individuals one-on-one. That's assuming you want to talk to somebody who likes Mitt Romney. So that was bad, and there is a closet Republican in this room, I'm sure, and I apologize to that one person. So generalities don't help, but here are my generalities anyway. Young adult children of intermarriage feel very positive about their connection to Judaism, and this number is also reflected in the general Jewish population. There's a genuine pride in being Jewish, and many feel that it's very important to them. And interestingly, 64% said they want to transmit a Jewish ethnic identity to their children, whatever they mean by ethnic identity, and that over and over again, we heard a fair degree of comfort in having dual identities, or really, the phrase multiple identities sounds, negative, but it's not just dual. Everybody has many different identities depending on the situations they're in, and younger generations are now much more fluid and feel much more comfortable with this, as opposed to generations, and I feel like I'm kind of on the border of going through life really mainly through a Jewish lens. This one you'll like. They experience Judaism through a secular culture. What that means, though, I think would merit more study. So, for example, a lot of these folks saw Schindler's List or Fiddler on the Roof and experienced it as Jewish somehow, as opposed to just playing on cable TV. And what and had a powerful impact on them. There was a connection there, also to Jewish food, Jewish humor. The commonality, of course, is that you don't need a rabbi for any of this. You don't need an organized community. People are connecting through secular Jewish culture, which we have, of course, infused with Jewish culture. There's an amazing amount of Yiddish being thrown around by people who have no right really to be using it and use it incorrectly, and it's just completely been infused in popular culture, and that could work to our advantage, but we very rarely take advantage of it as a Jewish community. And also, there's a very strong connection to opposing anti-Semitism and raising Holocaust awareness. And this is interesting because the Jewish community has made great efforts to move their education away from that because we're trying to find positive expressions of Jewish identity. And yet this still very much resonates for a lot of young adult children of intermarriage. Now that there are Jewish studies on college campuses, again, this is a secular outlet for folks who may or may not feel comfortable or embraced walking through the doors of Jewish institutions. And we also found that bar and bat mitzvah may be a pivotal indicator. Now, what I mean by indicator, you should know, doesn't mean cause and effect. It doesn't mean that if you give someone a bar or bat mitzvah, then they will identify only as Jewish for the rest of their lives. But it is a key indicator because all of the factors that go into providing a bar and bat mitzvah for someone help to create an identity that they then come out of it and say, yes, I'm fully Jewish. Which is something very interesting for the Jewish community to consider when so many synagogues won't let you be a bar bat mitzvah there, or won't let your child be bar bat mitzvah there unless you've gone through the requisite 3 or 4 years of Hebrew school there, of course, because that's their whole financial model. And yet so many children of intermarriage learn about bar and bat mitzvah by going to their friends' bar bat mitzvah. So synagogues are approached by families with a 12-year-old and say, can we get a bar mitzvah? And a lot of times the answer is, sure, enroll in Hebrew school, and when your kid is 15, we can do a bar and bat mitzvah, which is, of course, ridiculous, and people don't go for it. There's a new option, or growing option of simply hiring a rabbi who will do it who's not connected to a congregation. I think this is going to be one of the big changes we see over the next 10 years about congregations recognizing that the financial model of requirement, whether it's requirement of Hebrew school, whether it's requirement of buying high holiday tickets, is going to collapse, and we need to find other financial models. Matrilineal and patrilineal descent really should be, could be a conversation all for itself, but this is, to me, really essential in that many, if not most or all, children of intermarriage that are of patrilineal descent have been told at some point in their lives, oh, if your mom's not Jewish, then you're not really Jewish. And there is no, and it's great that we're having this conversation, and actually, I would say that this is the first I'm aware of, but I actually presented at one 6 weeks ago, so you missed it by 6 weeks. But the one I presented at, which was for the Academy of Jewish Religion, which is a rabbinic ordaining, unaffiliated institution in the Bronx. Before that, 12 years as a professional on this issue, I hadn't heard of any conversations around this. I think the main movements have to be having this conversation. I think the reform movement has to find some way to educate its young people about why they made the decision and to be able to answer that when they hear it, to prepare people. And I think that the other movements need to have conversations internally about what it means to be Jewish versus halakhically Jewish, and whether they are able to make a distinction between Jewish and halakhically Jewish. We asked folks on our online survey if you were going to respond to marketing from a Jewish organization, and we used these terms. Would you respond? How likely would you be to respond? And half Jewish came back with the most negative response from the young adult children of intermarriage that we interviewed, that filled out this online survey. which I think is really important and represents a real challenge, which is that when someone says that they're half Jewish, that's their identity. And not only should we not nullify it, but we have to find ways to affirm that. And at the same time, we have to recognize that a large percentage actually is offended by that word. And I think the first steps is more dialogue and conversation about why this works for some people, what it means when people say it, and so on. And the most positive reactions were things like Jewish, that was the most likely. Jews of all backgrounds, everyone, all welcome. Adult children of intermarriage was more popular than half Jewish. We didn't ask about Jews in all hues, but next time we will. And what we found also, and this confirms what I was talking about before about Jewish activities, when asked what you participate in and how frequently, folks with one Jewish parent who participated in something monthly were much more likely to participate in things that didn't require religiosity. So on self-guided Jewish activities, such as reading a book, a Jewish-themed book, they scored almost as high as folks with two Jewish parents. On educational activities, we gave them a variety of examples, also very similar. But on religious activities, on home-based celebrations, they scored much lower. Also, interestingly to me, the young adult children of intermarriage who had never participated in a Jewish social justice activity or Jewish social activities was also much higher than those with two Jewish parents. And to me, this is interesting because there's a big push in the organized Jewish community around social justice activities. And there's always been a push around social activities for young people. And I think we need to examine what's happening with those programs that are turning off young adult children of intermarriage. My guess on the social activities one is pretty easy, that a lot of them are thinly veiled opportunities to meet and marry other Jews. And that's actually one point I wanted to mention, that that Adam, when he spoke to open the day today, he talked about the American Jewish Committee's survey in 2000, where they asked all these questions and got answers that they really didn't like about intermarriage. Even though American Jews feel opposing intermarriage was racist, even though they would not sit shiva if their child intermarried, there was one question that he didn't mention, which was, do you feel the Jewish community has an obligation to promote in marriage? And something like 65% said yes. So basically, we still want our community to make us feel guilty about what we're doing. But on all the other issues, So I thought that those kind of mixed messages or dichotomies are worth exploring further. And one of them is also the idea of, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. What does that mean? Because in our work, we hear that over and over again. And again, this is not just from children of intermarriage. To me, personally, it has the meaning that I think that there may be something bigger than us, but it's not described in the liturgy that I see when I go to synagogue. But that's me. I think that there is a whole study here, if there's any sociologists or PhD candidates in the room, on what does it mean to be spiritual but not religious. Because this is from all Jews. I don't know if you saw this study that came out a couple of weeks ago. The big news from the study was that Jews still support Obama, as if we didn't know that. And that's what was covered from this study. But there were a lot of fascinating statistics from the Public Religion Research Institute survey of Jewish values. Just came out. To me, one of them was, and this isn't the first study to show this, comparing Jews to Americans, we 3-to-1 agree with the statement, I do not believe in God. And then we agree with the statement, God is an impersonal force, 40%. If you combine those two, a majority of Jews don't believe, to me, this says a majority of Jews don't believe God will answer your personal prayers. I still pray to God when I'm on airplanes, by the way. That's incredibly powerful, especially when compared to Americans, and I feel like the vanguard on this are interfaith families and young adult children of intermarriage. But regardless, this is something that needs to be addressed, and I know that secular humanism addresses it, but I think the other movements and the non-denominational organizations like Jewish community centers, let's open up this conversation and be more realistic. I mean, if I can talk to the heads of the reform movement, I would say, what is the role of the non-believer? And they say, yes, we accept doubters, and we have this wide spread of what it means to when you say the word God, but this is pretty powerful. And then, the ones who didn't know or refuse, this is way higher. So I think you could add half of that to the number. So we're talking about like over 60%. So to me, this is the great opportunity that if we look at the majority now, the children of intermarriage, or the majority of our households, married households that are intermarried, we have to help them answer, what does it mean to be Jewish? Why be Jewish? And we've seen tremendous strides. That's also where I take a lot of optimism. It may not feel like it, but the Jewish community can and does change. Even when I started doing this 12 years ago, there was a genuine debate in the Jewish community about should we welcome interfaith families. You almost never hear that. The question now is, how do we do it? How do we welcome interfaith families? In all the movements, even the conservative movement, it's no longer a question of should we, it's how should we. So that is a tremendous positive change. I think it's contributed to why so many interfaith families feel more comfortable now raising Jewish children, and why you can track that even as there are more interfaith families now, there are also more interfaith families raising Jewish children. So that's why I feel optimistic, but I also feel like there's a tremendous opportunity for growth. And then I just want to throw out some of the more wild things that this makes me think of, which is really, when we talk about matrilineal, patrilineal, can we just get rid of Judaism by birth altogether? And one of the things that I loved seeing last night was the statement that was read about who secular humanism accepts as Jewish is anyone who's Jewish by descent and anyone who identifies with Jewish religion, with Jewish tradition, history, and there were like culture and faith. So, and I'd throw in religion as well, but so to me, if someone says they're Jewish, I'm great. That's great. I mean, Ben Gurion said anyone who's meshug enough to call themselves Jewish is Jewish. That was his definition, and he was a pretty good Jew. So what would that look like? What would it look like for me to renounce my born Jewish privilege? And I just want to very briefly get into this concept of privilege, which, if you didn't know, if you're white, you have white privilege. And I admit, sadly, to not even having heard of this concept till later in life than I think I should have. But now that I know it, I see it everywhere, which is basically, you get away with stuff in America if you're white that you wouldn't get away with if you're black, or if you're Latino, or if you're a minority. And how do we extend that concept of privilege within the organized Jewish community? Well, if you go online and Google Ashkenazic privilege, you will find a list that talks about how privileged Ashkenazim are in the Jewish community to assume that everyone has matzah ball soup at their Passover Seder, or doesn't eat the things that we don't eat, which are a ridiculous list of things for Passover, or countless other aspects of Ashkenazic culture that is continually confused as Jewish culture. It's not Jewish culture, it's Ashkenazic culture. And wouldn't it be great if we just actually started calling it Ashkenazic culture, because then Sephardi might feel more included, and so would so many other people. So that is Ashkenazi privilege. I feel like we've got something called born Jewish privilege. And born Jewish privilege manifests itself in a lot of ways. And quite frankly, as someone who is born Jewish, I recognize how hard that would be for me to give it up, because I feel like this is my passport. I can go anywhere in the world, and no one can deny that I'm Jewish. And in fact, as I mentioned, my mom's parents survived the Holocaust. I mean, that's as much, how much more credo do I need? I mean, that is so powerful and substantial. Who's going to deny me my Judaism? But yet, when I think about, for example, being American, and I'm American technically because I was born in America, but is that how I walk around when I think of myself as an American, that I'm American because I was born American? I hope not. I don't think that's how I think of myself as American. I think I, as messed up as we are, really believe in the values that I selectively look at in America today. Did I qualify that enough? I'm leaving out the Second Amendment. But I feel that way about Judaism as well, that I need to say why I'm Jewish because of how it affects me today, and not because of the way I was born into it. And if we all did, what would our community look like then? And getting back to that idea about if people converted the way the biblical Ruth converted, how different would our community look? And I recognize these are real challenges, and especially, in Israel, it's a different challenge. Israel now is at a point where people actually want to move there, except the Israelis who are moving here. But, Israel is kind of a unique situation. But in America, what would it mean to give up some of our born Jewish privilege? I look forward to any pushback you might have on anything I said, and I really thank you for listening to me.
Okay, well, I know that you join me in thanking Paul for such wonderful, insightful remarks that he had as I was scribbling notes and all sorts of other things that he was prompting me to think about. I was also thinking about a lot of the couples that come to me if they want me to perform their marriage, where Ari and I were talking a little bit during the break about this, where people will say, if their parents call me, they say, I've been a member of such and such congregation for years since my children were born, and now the rabbi won't marry my children. And so they're angry at the Jewish community. They feel alienated from the Jewish community, and they've been a part of the Jewish community. I get calls from the children, the people who are going to be getting married, who then say, literally, this has been said to me with a deep sigh, you were my last hope. I mean, and there's other hopes up here, but, but when I get that phone call, that's what I'm hearing from people is, you will marry me? And, when you say, yes, do you love one another? And that's the standard, that it's like, again, this big sigh of relief, that they feel that the Jewish community, a part of the Jewish community, can come back and re-embrace them. And one of the things that occurred to me as you were speaking was this sort of issue of have-tos. You have to do things a certain way, that it must be done. So couples will say, I've heard, love that, I've heard that in a wedding ceremony, I have to, and then sort of fill in the blank. Or a couple that has a child that says, well, I've heard that for my child to be Jewish, I have to, and here it's only on the patrilineal descent kind of thing. So I guess my overall question is if you could address a little more in depth on the issue of sort of getting all these rumors or all of these have-tos out of people's head. They have a misguided notion of what's halachically expected of them, and we in this movement don't really abide by things that are halachically informed in the sense that you have to do it this way. So I was wondering if you have any comments on that topic.
Look, anger can be harnessed, and that's why I do the job that I do. Someone said that passion is love plus anger. I forgot who said that, but I'm passionate about what I do, and there's an element of my passion that is anger. So if people have been put off by the Jewish community, we need to harness their anger to create something new or to create something different or to change what it was that they were angry about. So I'm not that afraid of the anger piece, but it's the turning away of people that that I'm angry about, and the has to part obviously comes from what we at JOI probably not publicly should call it the fromest common denominator. So if we're gonna do a conference, we're gonna have kosher food for the 3 people that are coming to our conference that keep kosher, but to us that's actually inclusion, because those 3 people wouldn't come if we don't have a kosher conference, and we want to include them. So but it seems to only go in one direction, because in the other direction it's the have-tos. And to me, that's the fundamental challenge, is that you've got a segment of the community that finds such meaning in structure and rules, and that works for them, and they don't want to change that. And then all the rest of us are saying, we like the intellectual grappling, we like the questioning, and that's, so that I don't know how to really address that challenge other than for greater volume about acceptance. And that's what I was talking about on patrilineal descent, the Reform movement. And I just talk about the Reform movement because they're the largest movement in America. They accepted patrilineal descent, and then they went quiet about it, almost 30 years ago. They don't talk about it. They didn't celebrate the 25th anniversary of it. They just celebrated the 40th anniversary of ordaining the first woman rabbi, but they didn't say a thing about accepting patrilineal descent. They're like, it's a done deal. But it's not a done deal. I feel like they should be shouting it from the mountaintops, as should Reconstructionists, as should you guys. And I know you guys do, but you guys have a smaller mountain. So I would suggest let's all get this message out there, and I know I do. And the reverse is I've met patrilineal Jews who have said to me, "Oh yeah, my dad's Jewish, but I'm not really Jewish." Like they have absorbed that message, and I'm like, "Do you know that half of American Jews would accept you as Jewish if you said you're Jewish?" And they don't, and that's the piece that I think advocacy and education could really help on.
I wanted to first thank you for the idea that interfaith marriage is actually the best kiruv that we have. That was something that I hadn't heard before. Kiruv, for those who don't know, is like religious outreach. Right? Judaism is not an evangelical religion, but if now the majority of people who are born to one Jewish parent, then in fact people who are Jewish themselves who are marrying non-Jewish folks are actually the ones who are increasing the size of the Jewish population, which is a really interesting idea.
Well, here's the crazy thing about that. Statistically, if there was no intermarriage at all, our numbers would decline because we don't have enough babies. We have a below replacement rate of children. So, the replacement rate is 2.1%. Your population has, not percent, your population has to have 2.1 children per couple to replace itself, to maintain and replace itself. The Jewish community has a below 2.1 children per family birth rate. So if there was no intermarriage, we would shrink anyway. It's intermarriage that is actually growing the population, and we've seen it in Boston. And if you read the sociological study that they did of the Jewish community in Boston, they attribute a piece of the growth to intermarried families raising Jewish children. And again, these are sociologists who don't have an interest in promoting inclusion of interfaith families. So,
not to mention hybrid vigor.
Right, but of course then the next question is, what kind of Jews are they? That's the immediate next question you get. Is, oh yeah, they're raising Jewish children, but what kind of Jews are they? And so we have to. That's the next thing we have to answer.
Adam?
I'll get a flare gun so you can know what's going on down here. I want to get exactly to what Paul just ended with, and that is, what kind of Jews are they? I think that in some ways is the best answer to that challenging question of, well, you're not really Jewish, you were raised in one version. I was struck that the Forward newspaper, the last 2 weeks, had prominent pieces about patrilineal Jews. First one about the anniversary of the decision, and then secondly, an op-ed piece by a patrilineal Jew who was raised Reform, always felt identified as Jewish, wound up in a conservative community, and then actually had to out himself as patrilineal because they didn't know, but he felt inauthentic participating in a conservative synagogue. The rabbi said, "Why did you tell me?" He was doing aliyot and everything. So he went through a conversion, and at the end of the piece, he said, "I shouldn't have had to do this." You know, that's enough. But I think that the answer to the question of whether you're a Jew or not is comparable to another kind of, I think it's comparable to another kind of question. I'm curious if you agree. And that is, what you're doing isn't Judaism. You hear that too, whether it's from a secular perspective or from a Reform perspective without halakha, or from a conservative perspective with women rabbis. You get that same kind of thing. What you're doing, well, you might be Jewish, but what you're doing isn't Judaism. And if we can answer that question, or at least feel comfortable that there are going to be people out there who say what we do isn't Judaism, and we may never convince them, then it's a parallel to also answer the question that there are going to be people who might not think you're Jewish either. I mean, for us, we have the question that there are people who don't think we're rabbis. Same kind of problem.
Right. That's what I mean. We have to really ramp up the conversation about what is authentic Judaism. I mean, look, one of the great successes about Chabad, and I put successes in quotes, and part of it is an outreach methodology that we actually try to emulate in certain ways. They don't sit behind the four walls of their institution and expect people to come to them. They go to where the people are. That, to me, is the main definition of outreach. They don't judge you. They're less judgmental than many conservative rabbis. They allow patrilineal kids in their summer camps, and the conservative movement doesn't. Because the Chabad knows that we get the kids in, we'll get the families, and then once we have them, the conversion is before bat mitzvah is a dunk. And, you know, so they are, in a lot of ways, they're more inclusive. But to me, one of the things I've heard a lot of that's disturbing is that a lot of Jews look at Chabad and say, that's authentic Judaism. They're doing it right. I'm never going to do that myself, but I'll support them so that they kind of do it for me. And that's, I think, a disastrous way of thinking that I'd love to change. I'm not going there. But the op-ed that you mentioned in the foreword, which I hope folks will go back and read, his name is David A.M. Walensky, and he is the editor of Jewish Voices magazine, which is a independent student newspaper. He's only, I think, 24 years old, and so it was a very brave thing for him to come out and write this. But actually, and I was working on a piece, and then he put this out, so now I have to modify my piece. But I think what the mistake he made was the mistake I talked about in my presentation, that he was basically saying, I shouldn't have to do this because of who I am. And I think that's a less effective argument than saying, I shouldn't have to do this because you are morally and ethically on the wrong side. You know, that the ethics and morals have changed, just like they have on understanding that being gay and lesbian is not a wicked lifestyle choice. I mean, do you remember the phrase lifestyle choice? We hardly hear that anymore because we've become more knowledgeable about what's actually happening, and once we realize. And so, you know, was it a lifestyle choice for me to marry the person that I fell in love with? Like, should I have said no? Like, people in the Jewish community will say I should have walked away from that. But if you actually think about how few times you get to fall in love in your life, it's crazy, it's absurd. I think it's unethical to suggest that people should walk away from that. So to me, the argument is on morals and ethics. And in a movement like conservative, where they've already demonstrated that they will be flexible about it, that they're towing the line on this issue, to me, is absurd. And many people in the movement on the ground know it is. Many of their rabbinic students coming in are adult children of intermarriage. It's going to change, but the question is, what's going to be left once it finally changes?
I did whisper in Ari's ear that she was next up, but then I'll get to you, Dan. Go ahead.
So I have a question about community. I was really interested in how pivotal the bar and bat mitzvah experience can be, and we talk about the privatization of life cycle events, and more people want the private bar mitzvah wherever. I've certainly been asked to do them in various locations, including most recently an ice skating rink, but not on ice skates. No.
That would be cool.
That would be cool. And I was just meeting with a Reform rabbi who said to me, the Torah lives in the Arona Kodesh, right? The Torah doesn't live in your backyard, which I actually would say, yes, it does. I mean, yeah, that's so wrong. But, can you talk a little about community and affiliation for interfaith young folks? And is community on their minds? Do they feel part of a community? Is affiliation a word that, yeah.
So here's the challenge I see, and a big part of my job is just consulting with Jewish institutions. And here's what I feel that the inside of the Jewish community really isn't getting. All of American life really has moved to a service industry. And in a lot of ways, the Jewish community is a service industry. And community is not something people pay for. I'm on Facebook, it's free. Yes, I pay for my internet access a lot, but community, I have a community. I have family and friends, and we're a community. I don't feel obligated to pay for that thing of community, whatever that is. So the question is, what are people paying for when they affiliate with the Jewish community? And to me, affiliation simply means you're writing a check to a synagogue, to a JCC, to Federation. And so that model of I belong to a community and I'm going to show it with my checkbook is really changing. And now families are coming to the Jewish community as a service provider, and yes, a key service is Jewish education. So the biggest complaint I hear when I consult with synagogues is we have families, they come for 4 years to educate their kids, and then right after bar and bat mitzvah, they leave. And how can we retain them? And actually, I feel a lot of resentment on the part of these Jewish communal professionals. And I give them the perspective from the outside because I expect one day I'm going to be one of these people who leaves after bar and bar mitzvah. I just pay you $10,000 over 4 years or $12,000. My kid got educated. Now, what's the service that you're providing? And their answer is, well, we're a community. And I said, well, you had 4 years to impress on them that they are part of a community, and that as part of a community, they should feel a positive obligation, not the negative guilt obligation, but a recognition, this synagogue does good work and I want to support it. You had 4 years. They didn't get that message. What were you telling them during those 4 years? So to me, I think synagogues particularly, but all of the Jewish community needs to start moving toward a model of cause, or meaning, as I said, but also cause. Is synagogue a cause? I think synagogue is a cause. I think synagogue does amazing things for people. I think federations do amazing things for people. Meals on Wheels, they serve tons of non-Jews, and they never talk about it. And they talk about community and peoplehood. And I want to support the folks that are doing good work. And so if that's a synagogue or if that's the Red Cross, so to me, that's how I approach it, that this idea of community is not something that you charge for. It's something that happens among people with a common cause.
And in an effort to bring in some of the audience questions that at least a few of you are probably sitting on your hands saying, that was my question. Right? This is my topic. Why are you not addressing this? A couple of people addressed things relating to bar and bat mitzvah in particular, since that was our launching point. In a very specific question about the slide referring to bar and bat mitzvah as a pivotal indicator of religious identity. And the question was, should that be changed to cultural identity? And in that regard, when you were talking about this sort of term, and I hear it a lot too, I'm spiritual but not religious, I'm wondering if perhaps what people are saying with that is, I'm searching for community, I'm searching for something that's more than myself, but organized religion is what turns me off.
That was simply the answer to the question, what religion are you? They said Jewish. We looked at who said Jewish. 90% of them had a bar and bat mitzvah. Only 30% of the cohort said Jewish, but of those, 90% of them had a bar or bat mitzvah. Again, it's not the cause and effect, but it could be the pivotal moment because you're standing up in front of your friends and family and saying, I'm a Jew. And I don't think it's because you learned how to daven with trope. You know, I think it's because you're standing up there and saying, I'm a Jew in front of everybody that's important to you. And I think that's an incredibly powerful moment in the lives of people who experience it. And I think the Jewish community is obligated to make sure that that's available to anyone who wants it.
Dan?
Yoni wants to
Oh,
cut
yeah.
in front. That's
Okay, go ahead.
I wanted to
Push back,
I
yes.
just wanted to push back on the idea of people don't pay for communities, and also tie that into some of the points that you made before. People do pay for communities. People pay for kickball leagues. People pay to visit their families. People pay to do college reunions. People do pay for things that they value, right? They don't pay for things that they feel. This idea of, you said financial models of requirement are collapsing. Identity models of requirement are collapsing as well. And I think that that's one of the really interesting things is that Judaism of compulsion, the outside world isn't dangerous to us anymore in a way that it was, that allowed for Judaism of compulsion to provide a safety net. And I think that there are, I mean, and this was your point, but I think people will pay for things that they find valuable and meaningful.
No, I think that's fair. And I think, first of all, I don't think anyone's paying $2,000 a year to play kickball. So I think that synagogues have moved to a model where they recognize that when the services that they provide to families and kids end, that there can be a modified level of giving. But it's about the value and the meaning of being involved in a community and understanding what the community is trying to accomplish. And the way that synagogues in this example pitch themselves as bar mitzvah factories. I mean, they don't pitch themselves as that, but they position themselves as a provider of Jewish education because this is their core business. So your understanding going into it is this is the meaning and value that they provide. And we got it, and it was great, and we had a fantastic time. And now we're done. Yeah, and it's a transaction. And the wonderful people I met at synagogue, we go out to dinner with, you know, and that worked out great. And, you know, if I'm going to join a kickball league, I'm not necessarily going to feel like I am now a lifelong kickball player. And, you know, but I hear what you're saying. It's about meaning and value, and people need to understand the value of what that community is trying to accomplish. And when the community is trying to accomplish education through bar mitzvah, then that's the meaning and value. But if the meaning and value is to create like a prayer community or a social justice community, as some synagogues have moved toward, then you can be involved much longer because you know what the goals are, and it's different than come here for 4 years and educate your kids at a very high, expensive cost.
Dan?
So I just want to, you know, what you talked about, the born Jewish privilege, reminded me of, on the flip side, my wife and I were having a conversation. I think I was saying I didn't feel sentimental about, you know, Eastern Europe and my ancestors and whatever, and she said, you really don't feel sentimental at all? And I said, I don't know, I think they're probably all Mormons anyway by now. But I want to ask you about the sort of advocacy agenda as opposed to the sort of agenda of just saying, you know, let's do great things. I mean, I think that the conservative movement has been a follower at every stage, and my question is whether to even express resentment or a desire to be included is sort of a misplaced effort in the sense of just saying, you know, let's just build something great, and let's build something great that is built out of the experience of children of intermarriage and whatever other sort of identifiers there are. And you know, I think that from the perspective of the conservative movement or the Orthodox movement, and I'll just say on that, there's a Orthodox minyan that meets at Hillel, and at one point they needed a minyan, and they came out, and the husband of one of the members, the very loyal members of the minyan, was standing outside in the hallway, and they said, "Would you please come in and help us make a minyan?" And he said, "I'd love to, but I'm not Jewish." I mean, this is an Orthodox minyan, so I think that this is going on everywhere. But the question is, from their perspective, I think they're saying, look, it's not as simple as just saying, it's a question of ethics, or we should be more inclusive. I mean, they're saying, in the same way that the United States doesn't have just a completely open immigration policy, right, that we have to have a process, and we have to have rules, and we have to have a way of maintaining our society and not just throwing the doors open so you can immigrate, but there are rules and there are processes, and if you want to do it a different way, then we don't accept it. And it seems to me that that's not a completely immoral or illegitimate perspective, because they believe that Judaism is something essential, that it has an essence, and that they're trying to describe it. And we can disagree with that, but I think that there's some sense in which that this question will be answered in either one of two ways, either in the marketplace of ideas, and I think that the answer there is to build something great that works, and then people will start coming over, because, as you say, the members of conservative synagogues, they're not conservative Jews. They would love to if there was a more compelling alternative, they would drop it in a second, right? And so why are we trying to get into there as opposed to building something great? And at the same time, so one possible way that this is solved is the marketplace of ideas, and the other part is a schism, right? And there's a question about whether our ideas of peoplehood and Klal Yisrael, maybe this is a time in which we should be challenging some of those questions, some of those values as well, and to say that sometimes the time comes when we actually have to split into two different groups. And if there's part of the community that says, we really do place extreme value on birth, then that's one direction. And those who say we place great value on, as you say, meaning, and regardless of birth, then that goes in a different direction. And that's not necessarily the tragedy that communal leaders tend to talk about it as. So I'm curious what you think about that.
No, I think that's good, and I'm glad I'm getting this kind of pushback, because it requires me to come up with even more answers. But to me, the advocacy agenda is to let people know that you are Jewish if you want to be. Like, to me, that would be the big message. And I think that the conservative movement is such an important tipping point, where when they tip, people in America will know much more clearly that liberal Judaism accepts patrilineal descent. And quite frankly, when there were conversations, Rabbi Andy Bachman wrote an op-ed in the Forward a year ago about the conversations that happened between the Reform and conservative movement before Reform accepted patrilineal. And conservative, there was actually a dialogue, and conservative said, if you add a mikvah and blah, blah, just make it a mikvah, then we'll accept it too. And the Reform movement said, no, this was third hand. I don't know if that really happened, but there was a conversation. And the conservative movement threw their lot in with the Orthodox that now won't accept conservative conversions. So they threw their lot in with the wrong side. And if they switch, to me, that's just the pivotal thing for the advocacy that I care about, which is to let people know, which is to reach the people that I've met who really don't know anything about being Jewish except that their dad is Jewish, but that they can't call themselves Jewish because it's only their dad. And getting that tipping point, I think, would be fantastic. And look, it's going to happen. That same survey, the last slide that I put on the general survey, showed that 82% of American Jewry supports gay marriage. I mean, that is a tipping point that tipped in a big way and long ago, and now the conservative movement is on board with it. And I think that this is going to happen. But as when you mention advocacy, it's about getting to those folks who are so far out that they're not hearing that message yet. I think it would be helpful. But as far as maybe it's not unethical to maintain boundaries, but it sure feels random to me. So if you don't want to say ethical or moral, they're maintaining that is so random, and when I've asked for the meaning, what's the meaning behind it? So when I say moral and ethical, I'm saying, what's the actual Jewish meaning? Why do it? And like I said, I presented 6 weeks ago to rabbinic students, and the first answer I got was, well, they did it because that way you really know for sure who the mother is. And so I said, okay, so what I'm hearing as an intermarried Jew is you think my wife is cheating on me. And you want to make sure that it's really my baby. That is an irrelevant response. And quite frankly, it just points out that in the actual Bible, it was patrilineal descent, and we made the switch. So we can make the switch. Right now, it just feels random. And to me, that undercuts all of their other messages about why be Jewish.
Sivan?
I just want to start with something that, apropos Ashkenazi, that may free us a little bit from these cardboard matzahs that we eat on the Seder, and to remind you that there's an Iraqi matzah, which is very good. It's very much like a wrap, so enjoy. But I have the question of diversity is something that, Dan, you brought up, or the fact that we disagree sometimes to an extreme extent, really looks at the term pluralism. I think that Judaism was didn't accept plurality, but lived plurality. And I think it's about time we really attach the ism to it and do become an ideological entity that supports extreme differences and still sees us as a united people. So I wouldn't give up on saying we're still one, even if we extremely disagree. But a question, is there, do you have any knowledge about children of diverse backgrounds and their approach to two things? One is it different in any way to the general Jewish population in relation to Israel? And the second, in relation to marrying Jewish. I mean, would they prefer marrying Jewish, or the contrary, or any other option to this question?
Yeah, definitely. On the marrying Jewish, they absolutely do not see the need to marry Jewish. They answer that question much lower than Jews who are born to Jewish parents, and I think for obvious reasons, and especially for people who are of intermarried parents but identify as Jewish. Clearly, it works. Like, it can happen. You can be from an interfaith family and consider yourself fully Jewish. So why would they then, but there is a phenomenon called return marriage, which is documented in those national Jewish population studies, which offset the total of intermarriage because there is a significant enough to measure percentage of children of intermarriage that do marry Jews. Or, anecdotally, I know many adult children of intermarriage feel a kinship with other adult children of intermarriage. So there's something there. But yeah, generally they don't see the need to, so the messages they may hear on Birthright Israel about, you should marry Jewish, which I know that is a frequent refrain for the patrilineal or the children of intermarriage that come back from Birthright. And I don't want to bash Birthright because Birthright is the most successful, largest outreach to young adult children of intermarriage ever. They've sent probably 100,000 children of intermarriage to Israel at this point, and that's phenomenal. But anecdotally, the stories I've heard coming back is, and I recognize that this is also a challenge for Israelis to understand just how dramatically different American Jewry is. And on the issue of approach to Israel, they care a lot less about Israel. I mean, and again, this is where demography gets really screwy, because when you talk about the children of intermarriage, you're including people who consider themselves Christian. So right off the bat, there's a weighing. So if you narrow it to people who self-identify as fully Jewish, then it goes up a little bit, but it's still less than people with 2 Jewish parents. And I would guess at the reason that they have been turned off or pushed away at some point by other Jews. And so how much kinship are they really going to feel after they've been rejected in some ways, even if they still feel fully Jewish?
Jill? Okay, this will be the last panel question.
I think there's a new discussion that we need to have, and that's the whole question of circumcision, because now more and more and more I am getting questions about does humanistic Judaism require that you be, a male be circumcised to be a Jew? And, many of us have seen the documentary cut and a lot of discussion about how this is going to affect circumcision and to some people then Jewish identity.
Wow, well, I don't know that anybody has asked the question on a large scale of whether more children of intermarriage are circumcised or not, or would they circumcise their kids? I can only speak personally in that my wife and I plan to have a family, and if we have a boy, I will probably, kind of look away and have them circumcised. But if I'm the last Jew in my lineage to do it, I'm not sure I would feel that bad about it. So I'm very torn. It is as tribal as it gets, and but I mean, I'm not going to go into the positives and negatives, but believe me, I think about it all the time. And if my Jewish wedding wasn't hard enough to explain to my Japanese in-laws who live in Tokyo, to have them come out for a bris, so in Asian cultures, breaking something is bad luck. So what's the very first thing I do after we get married is I crush a glass, so right off the bat, there's that, so the very first thing we're going to do if we have a boy, I have my mother's brother, so this is the son of my Holocaust surviving grandparents, intermarried a lapsed Roman Catholic in 1979, and had 4 children, raised them to identify, I believe they identify to varying degrees as just Jewish, religiously, even though they're not religious, and also they have a connection to their Irish ethnicity in some ways. But the oldest is their son married a woman who converted to Judaism not because he asked her to, but because she was actually into it. So together they are 1/4 Jewish, their household, and they will raise their kids Jewish from 1/4. But they had a son, and they decided not to circumcise, and we didn't chastise them or anything, but certainly my parents and I really were like, wow, it surprised us, but I think it made us really have to think about, again, the meaning and value of this ritual. Does this really have meaning and value? And I think I'm at like 52%, and that's why I would do it if it comes up, but it's really, really challenging.
Well, I know generally when there's a bris, it's followed by a meal. But I don't want the last thing to be on your mind before the lunch break is all about circumcision. So I will tell you that there are a lot of wonderful other comments and questions that I'm going to share with the other facilitators so that should the opportunity arise, even in other sessions or in Adam's wrap-up tomorrow, to address some of the larger issues that are not very specific to Paul's presentation, I hope that they will be addressed. I know that you all will join me in thanking Paul Golin for a remarkable presentation.
Thank you.